Hi, everyone, and welcome to episode 10 of the Economic Forces Podcast. I'm Brian Albrecht, now at the International Center for Law and Economics. New job. Let people know about that. I'm always joined by Josh Hendrickson, who's at Ole Miss. And this podcast is a supplement for our weekly newsletter, which you can find at pricetheory.substack.com. Who are we talking with today, Josh?
So we have two guests. So we have Mark Koyama from George Mason, and we have Jared Rubin from Chapman University. And they've written a book entitled How the World Became Rich. And so today we're going to spend all of our time kind of talking to them about this book. And so maybe we always kind of start off with like a way to kind of ease into the conversation. So maybe you guys can just kind of tell us what does it mean that the world got rich, and what can you tell us about the scale and the timing of this kind of growth process?
So what we mean by the world has got rich is that the majority of people in the world live in societies which are rich by historical standards. So that is saying about 4/5 of the world population don't live in extreme poverty. So there's still around 1 billion people who are living in very poor societies and are mired in close to subsistence poverty, but 4/5 of the population aren't. We're in some around 1 billion people are in what we would think of as rich countries, so in the United States, Canada, Australia, Western Europe, Japan, South Korea, Singapore. And then the remaining people living in countries like Mexico or countries in like India or China, which are by historical standards relatively rich. So the people are no longer faced with hard subsistence choices. Do I have enough money to feed my family? They're not rich in the sense they all drive around Bentleys or Rolls Royces and fly business class, but by historical standards, they're rich. So this is a big deal. People in a country like the United States or Western Europe are around 15 to 20 times richer than their ancestors were before 1800. So that's what we mean, and that's a huge thing. That's huge. It's because there are many more people than there were 200 years ago. The world population is more than 7 billion. So it's a tremendous achievement with so many people living outside poverty. And it's an achievement that we don't always recognize because we're preoccupied with, crises, the financial crisis, COVID-19, rising inequality, climate change, and so on. But our book is really about the story of how the world, broadly speaking, escaped from dire poverty.
As I read the book, it's really a fitting, it's a great book. I recommend all of our listeners buy it, buy multiple copies, send it to your friends, do all that stuff. It's a culmination of a lot of research that's happened over the last few decades. I wonder if you could walk us through kind of the different strands, different theories that we've especially seen in the last few decades put forward for the big question, right? Because the big question goes back to Smith, right? Before that even, but it's been central to economics. What has been the real change over the last 30 years in the economics research that justifies kind of, I think, is a nice intro to your guys' book?
Yeah, Brian, you're right. These are not new questions for sure. Obviously Smith's most famous book was The Wealth of Nations. That's what he was trying to understand. In almost kind of an ironic sense, both he and Malthus were living at a time where the change was happening as well. So the types of theories that would have come about, well back, centuries ago, just wouldn't have been able to explain what's happening now. And even in the last, so we'll say 2 decades, that's really what this book is about, is trying to distill the various theories and debates that have happened in, say, the last couple of decades. There has been a flurry of research along a host of different categories, and that's what this book tries to do, is try to categorize these different literatures and synthesize them as well to really say, well, what are the main points that are being brought forward? Some of this I think has to do with new data that is just was not possible to have a couple decades ago. That's through digitization, machine learning, things like this, certainly new econometric techniques, as well as computing power that allows us to say a lot more empirically than would have been the case even when I was in grad school in the early 2000s. So that's part of the reason why we have new theories. And also we just have, I think there's now been new lines of scholarship that are really trying to get at some of these. So what we've done in the first half of the book is brought these into 5 different categories that they're more or less what each of the chapters 2 through 6 after introductory chapter is about. These are theories based on geography, institutions, culture, demography, and colonization. I guess we can briefly talk about each of these. Geography is one of the older ones that goes back hundreds, if not thousands of years, thinking about why certain climates might have been more amenable to economic development or not. We even bring a few quotes in the book that show at certain times in history, European climate was thought to be a detriment to economic development. Later on, it was thought to be the reason or a reason why Europeans were able to succeed. There's much more than just climate. It's disease, environment, soil quality, things like this that might either, so I guess one additional thing while explaining this we should note is that it's not, the book in this literature really is not just how and why parts of the world became rich. It's why other parts of the world did not or were delayed in becoming wealthy. And as Mark said, why wealthy here, we mean wealthy relative to the baseline of humanity prior to a couple hundred years ago. Institutional explanations follow in the lines, particularly of Douglas North, who really brought institutional analysis back to economic history, and then a number of people who followed in his wake that have really added to the way we think about how things like legal, political, social, religious institutions have played in economic development, again, or lack thereof in certain parts of the world. And intertwined with this is our third set of explanations, which revolve around culture. Now, this is something that we try to be very careful on in discussing, because cultural explanations can veer towards either Eurocentric or anti, say, Islamic or anti-Eastern or something like that. And that's not what we're the type of explanation that we're interested in here, or really even discuss at any length here. We mainly discuss explanations that look at certain cultural attributes the way more modern cultural anthropologists think about cultures, this worldview, so stuff like trust has been something that's been really widely studied in the last couple decades, often through survey data and also experimental analyses, that we can really see how that differs across societies. And we think of trust as being central to economic exchange. So this is something we then ask, well, where, or the literature rather asks, where do these differences in cultural traits come from, especially those that might contribute to economic development or lack thereof? The fourth one, demography. I mentioned Malthus a few minutes ago. So he was the kind of the big proponent, and that's still the Malthusian dynamics are still kind of central to views that take demography seriously, namely that, so Malthus's prediction is that a large fraction of the population would end up in the long run around subsistence, because even if there were one-off events that increased productivity, eventually those productivity gains, at least at a per capita basis, would be eaten away by more children. And this was a fairly, I think, correct way of describing much of the world prior to, say, 1800, and actually still in the 19th and 20th century parts of the world. The question is, how does this change? Were demographic patterns different in parts of the world, particularly Northern Europe? There's marriage patterns that are different, and eventually parts of Europe go through what is known as a demographic transition to fewer kids, fewer births, fewer deaths, and these are all viewed as quite important in the rise of the modern economy. And finally, we look at colonization. And the colonization in particular is one of those things where I think it does a pretty good job at explaining why certain parts of the world have been so slow to catch up. One thing we do in this book is we do push on whether it's a good explanation for modern wealth, as some, especially historians, historians of capitalism, have recently argued. There's quite a big debate on that, and we try to just distill that debate. At least in the first half of the book, we don't really try to come down strongly one way or the other. The second half of the book, we do. And we can leave that for future discussion.
One issue that you have when you're studying like this big picture topic, and I think that you guys do a good job of actually illustrating this issue, is the problem of ex post storytelling, right? So there's there's a sort of juxtaposition of two quotes. I think it's in the chapter on geography where you talk about this quote from like the 11th century where it's talking about, well, of course Europeans are poor because like look at where they live and the circumstances and et cetera. And then you fast forward to like the 18th century and then it's like, well, of course Europeans are rich, like look at where they live and that sort of thing. And so, and then the thing is if you think about those quotes in isolation, they both, like there's a compelling argument there, right? Like that there are these factors that of course are hindering growth or that of course are promoting growth. But these are really just like ex post storytelling, right? It's just, well, we see that this place is poor, we see that this place is rich, so we'll just construct like this narrative. And so, so maybe you guys could talk a little bit about how economists, can kind of sort through this and avoid some of the problems with ex post storytelling.
Yeah, that's a great question. We also have a similar example of culture that if you read cultural accounts of particularly beginning late 90s into 2000s. There's a kind of a business book you pick up at the airport about the rise of China or East Asian countries like Singapore and South Korea. And it's like, what do we have in common? Well, we have this Confucian heritage. Confucianism encourages savings. That's going to be good for growth in some kind of conventional solo model framework. So that's why they're growing fast. But you only have to look a few decades earlier, and people are saying, why is China stagnant? Well, Confucianism inhibits innovation. It's very conservative. It's about venerating your ancestors. So that's also an ex post kind of story. So I think the way economists and you guys will like this particularly try and discipline those stories is with theory, right? So economic theory is one way of disciplining some of those stories, but we have a pretty sophisticated way of viewing the world. Individuals are purposeful, they're rational in some sense, and they respond to incentives, and a lot of the incentives they face are via the price system. And so that's one way to guide our thinking on this as economists. And I think we try to do that as throughout without we're not very, we're also not heavy-handed about it. We're not forcing theory or model down readers' throats. But I think subtly, implicitly, we're saying, look, we know the incentives people have to invest or to trade and so on are shaped by institutions, for example. And so why were institutions set up such a way in the past that it wasn't always, well, even if you did have an incentive to invest money, like the chances of it succeeding might be low. Trade was risky, say in the Middle Ages. Returns to innovation were quite low or speculative until the modern period. So we try and implicitly, without being super explicit about it, implicitly, I think build a story where incentives are there. So that's actually reflected also in the culture chapter that Jared was mentioning. So if you talk to non-economists or even some of the older works like David Lander's 138 book, when people talk about culture, they think about it as an extra economic factor, something outside of economics. So someone's culturally conservative, that means they won't innovate at all. But that's not how we're thinking about culture. We're thinking about it in a kind of in a way that it's working through incentives, right? So maybe if someone has cultural traits that make them whatever it is, more conservative or less willing to take risks, they're still responsive to prices. It's just their cultural traits will interact with the prices they face, so they might be less willing to take an entrepreneurial risk than someone else, but they're not totally unresponsive to material incentives as well. So I think economic theory is guiding our argument, but we're doing it in a way without like telling someone, look, you've got to believe in Homo economicus to read this book, or you've got to write down a model to read this book.
Yeah, and I'd like to add maybe one thing on this is that I think one thing that's really important too is that we try to make clear in a number of spots throughout the book is that we are not by any means promoting a deterministic view of history. And really what I think one of the big lessons from our book is that you have to really get into the history and understand the pathway through which A connected to B, connected to C, connected to D, to get to whatever your end point is. And this is something, as Mark was just mentioning, like cultural differences or institutional differences across societies. We can have theories, and we do, that help guide us and help us think through what that should mean for incentives. But really, unless you understand how these cultures or institutions evolved over time, the theory is, in a sense, it's not as useful because you don't know where to start from. So I think on this point, yes, I mean, we certainly have an endpoint that we want to understand, or, and that endpoint's obviously evolving as well. If we write a second edition of this book in, say, 10 years, some of the, especially the latter chapters, will probably look quite a bit different. That said, I think that, we're both economic historians too. And, one thing that we both certainly subscribe to is that if you don't really, just going back and finding a starting point, say something happened in 1500, and maybe finding there's papers that do this today, that then link this to something in the modern day, and maybe, their identification strategy is extremely sound, and you might be able to say there's something causal here. But unless you really understand what's connecting those two things, then Josh, I mean, I do think that you're at least doing some degree of kind of ex post rationalization that for us, at least, I certainly can speak for myself here, is really unsatisfying. And that's one thing that, we obviously can't do too much of that in a 200-page book that's meant to be highly readable as well. We're not talking about, the robustness checks and causal, the types of causal inference that academic papers do. But I think underlying everything that we've done is this type of idea. So it's a great question.
Yeah, there's an interesting back and forth in the book, because I mean, how the world got rich, that's a huge overarching, that's the big question, as I said in my previous question. But paragraph by paragraph, that's not what you're actually doing. You're looking at very particular cases of North versus South Italy, of this country versus that. It's kind of it's building it up piece by piece, which I think is interesting. It makes sense from the way the way the literature is. The literature and doing economic history today is more about those kind of, let's really dig into a particular case. Maybe we draw it up to today, maybe we don't, but it's a more microeconomic in that sense approach. And what I see as the value of the book is, for me as an outsider, I am not an economic historian by any means. I wrote one paper with Josh that flirts with the idea of being an economic historian. But for me as an outsider, it's an interesting, helpful way to kind of get a lay of the land, kind of make sense of all these different arguments without having to get bogged down in actually picking up the paper and saying, oh, is this identification strategy legitimate? Which I'm not going to be a judge of anyways. So.
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing on this point is that most papers in economics, are trying to make a point, maybe 2 points at most. And because of that, especially empirical papers today, they're really trying, I mean, the point they're trying to make is some type of causal argument, and that's where 90% of or more of the empirical analysis lies. Mm-hmm. We think that, again, I can speak for myself, I think Mark thinks this too, that many of these papers are very valuable in and of themselves for getting at something that is very narrow. One thing we're trying to do in this book is really to bring these together and say, really, the sum of this is much more than, or that rather the whole is much more than the sum of its parts, right? That when we consider, say, papers on the North-South Italy divide, which there are a lot of, because that's one instance where we really do see cultural differences and institutional differences, and but that also teaches us something more broadly about the role that, say, trust plays, or the role that, especially trust in certain types of institutions plays. And then we can kind of combine that with other studies that look at similar type of cultural attributes or institutional attributes in different parts of the world, say, all right, well, this if this might give us some of these, what we eventually call in the latter half of the book, preconditions that should be important, at least for the onset of modern economic growth. And then where can we see where some of these preconditions might have been? Obviously, the first place you're going to look is Britain, because that is where the modern economy first emerged. It's where industrialization first emerged. Well, what was going on there? Can this broader literature that is often not about Britain at all, or in some cases, I think rightfully so, not even about Western Europe, what can this teach us about the types of things that might be important? And also what types of things might be important in some contexts but not others. As I just mentioned in my answer to your last question, we think it's really important to understand that what worked in Britain in the late 18th and early 19th centuries is not necessarily transportable to other parts of the world. And part of the goal of the book, I would hope at least, is if say policymakers, influential people actually decide to pick this book up and want to say, well, what can we do in places like sub-Saharan Africa, Central Asia, places that that still lag behind on many fronts. It's not just to say, all right, can we recreate what happened in 19th century Britain or 20th century US or something like that. There are important elements that we might think of as being important, but they also have to be molded towards pre-existing institutional and cultural characteristics, for instance. So it's a very long-winded answer to that question, but yeah, it's a good one.
I think that's really helpful. Since we're talking about Britain, maybe that's a nice place to start. I had a question. This is maybe from my own confusion of the reading, but when I read McCloskey, and I can barely put two words together, so don't trust my reading on it. I read it as kind of a story of her, as telling a story of, the Dutch and then sort of taken over by the English. When I read your book, I see much more of a break. You guys are stressing it's not the major theme of your book, but when you explicitly are talking about Britain, there was the Dutch, but really Britain's where things took off. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about those two cases, why you think they had the preconditions for growth, and then why we see the divergence. It's not just they both move up together.
It's a great question, Brian. It's a very good one. It's one we actually had some back and forth about. And I think so. Jared may disagree a little bit with me, but I think that there are two things going on here. One is that there are previous episodes of economic growth before the Dutch, which are not quite remarkable in their own right. So people talk about some China, Renaissance Italy, ancient Greece, and as we've got better and better data, those seem to be quite remarkable for periods of economic growth as well, commercialization, greater specialization, innovation on some margins. But what we know about all of those episodes is they kind of reverse themselves. They peter out. They fail's too strong a word, but they don't sustain the growth. Like rent seeking brings it to an end. So Florence is booming in the 13th and 14th century. When it recovers from the plague, and it's still booming, but by about 1500, it's clearly economically in decline, and by 1650, definitely so. Venice is similar. And so why is that? Well, you could tell stories about internal rent seeking. So the merchants who were dynamic, they start becoming landowners. They start becoming less innovative, and then rivals come in and take their markets from them. Now, then there's the Industrial Revolution England, and what we know about Industrial Revolution England is that from that point on, the growth was sustained, right? So thinking about just the United Kingdom on its own, the British economy moves on to a path of faster growth thereafter. So even if there's a period in the late 19th century, early 20th century where it's no longer revolutionary, it's still growing at a faster rate than it was before. And of course, the other feature about the Industrial Revolution is growth spreads to North America and then to parts of Northern Europe like Germany and Belgium. And so then the question is where to categorize the Dutch Republic. Is it more like Industrial Revolution England, or is it more like Renaissance Florence? And there's an important book by De Waard and De Vries in 1997 called The First Modern Economy that makes the case that the Dutch were on some dimensions quote unquote modern, in the sense that they had a lot of the commercial sector, the service sector was quite a large proportion of the economy. So a lot of people not in agriculture anymore. But it doesn't have a large manufacturing base, unlike Industrial Revolution England. And so whether it's the first modern economy is kind of maybe a matter of taste or definition. But it, to my mind at least, it shares some of the features of these earlier case studies. So the Dutch are really rich in 1650. Like, Britain doesn't overtake Dutch income levels until well into the late second part of the 19th century. And even when Adam Smith is writing, the Dutch Republic is richer in per capita terms than Britain is. But the growth stops in the mid 17th century, and it seems to stop partly because of the burden of ongoing conflict with the Spanish and the French, and the taxes which are raised to pay off the cost of those military conflicts are really quite burdensome. And there's also a story of domestic rent seeking as well. So by the 18th century, the Dutch economy does look much less productive than the British one. And so for me, that makes me think that the decisive break seems to be in 18th century Britain more than in the Dutch Republic. But I agree it's a matter of taste to a degree. I mean, I could legitimately, you could disagree with that position.
Yeah, I think the one really important thing to add to this is that, especially, and we kind of, I think we definitely side with Joel Moynier on kind of the role that technology plays. That if we really want to think about the path to the modern economy, the role that sustained technological progress played is immense, and that's to some degree what needs to be explained. How do we get sustained technological development? What are especially the economic preconditions that allow for that? And that's not really how the Dutch became wealthy. The Dutch were maritime, so trade was extremely important. And for them to become as wealthy as they did, they had to have, and this is a point we make in the book, is they still had to have a number of these preconditions that we view as important, like the type of institutions that are less extractive, that are relatively limited. In terms of what the sovereign can do. In the case of the Dutch Republic, the sovereign was really the parliament. So they did have some of the preconditions. So what McCloskey points to is she's more about the kind of the cultural preconditions, valuing work, valuing labor, things like this. I whether you buy her argument or not, and she makes some, I think, some compelling points on what was going on in the Dutch Republic and Britain in the early modern period. Part of the point that we're making is that it wasn't just one thing or even two things that happened in Britain, that coalesced in Britain in this period, because Britain had a number of things. They had this type of culture, which they shared with, I think, to a large degree with the Dutch Republic and a few other places. The idea that stuff like the scientific revolution that was happening at the time was more or less a pan-European phenomenon. It was certainly not something that was just happening in England. England also had, something that Joel Moynier and some other co-authors like Morton Kelly and Cormac O'Grada have recently put forth. They had a number of highly skilled workers. This was something that the Dutch had on different margins, but places like the independent cities of the Holy Roman Empire, for instance, had an abundance. This was kind of, from the old guilds of the medieval period. This is where a lot of that type of really highly skilled labor was being done. And there are a number of other things as well, like large internal markets, which the Dutch didn't have. It was much smaller than England, for instance, that we highlight in this book. And the idea is that none of these are silver bullets, to use the more jargony terms of economics, none of these were sufficient. And it's not even necessarily obvious that any of them were necessary, even though all of them were likely necessary for England to develop the way it did. And what ended up happening, though, is the fact that they coalesced together in one place at one time is what's important, not each individual. So yeah, to get to your original question, I do think McCloskey's argument is compelling on some fronts, but not as compelling for why England in particular became technologically so sophisticated, and really that's where the sustained technological development occurred, but not in the Dutch Republic.
I think one of the things about economic growth is that it feels like every question that you answer poses a new question. So like when you if you ask students like, why does growth begin in England, they'll say something like, well, the Industrial Revolution. And you say, well, yeah, but then what causes the Industrial Revolution, right? And but I do have a question about this because there is a debate about um, uh, there is a debate about this, and I kind of wonder to what extent, like the Industrial Revolution, is about technological innovation, and to what extent it's about sort of harnessing energy. And so I know there's this literature that's kind of like, well, the reason England got rich is because, England has coal, and coal produces energy, and energy is necessary to run, you know, uh, mechanized tools and things like that, and that makes us more productive. And so, maybe you guys can talk a little bit about the coal debate that goes on, and what we learn and don't learn about economic growth from this kind of debate.
Yeah, so the story is a long-standing one. So, and I think the person, I mean, there are two people who are particularly, I think, influential in pushing it in recent decades. One is E.A. Wrigley, who was a demographer, historical demographer at Cambridge, and then also Bob Allen, who used to be at Oxford, is now NYU Abu Dhabi. I think they're the two um, best advocates for the role of coal. It also plays an important role in Ken Pomerantz's book, The Great Divergence. Ian Wrigley basically, yeah, gets at this almost, you could say, it's almost like a physicist's perspective on this. He discusses how much more energy you release if you have access to coal, because coal's, in some sense, it's stored so much energy from the sun over thousands of years, and you can release all of it by burning it. So coal is just a much more intensive um, uh, 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 source of fuel than is just wood or even charcoal. And so, and the thing about England, which is notable, is that it becomes a coal using economy fairly early on. So there's this deforestation is happening in the late Middle Ages, and so they start burning coal for heat in cities like London in the 16th century already. That's the beginning of the coal industry, and then but a lot of the coal is hard to access. So it's just on the surface. You can only access the coal which is really on the surface. But they know there's loads of coal much deeper down, but it's very dangerous to mine it because as you mine it, you basically, the mines get flooded all the time. And so the big innovation in the early 18th century is to use steam engines to basically pump the water out of the mines. And then you can access the coal, which is buried in large chunks of the north of England, but also southwest Wales. And so, if you kind of take a non-economist perspective on this, Wrigley, he's more of a historical geographer than an economist. Then it's like this is a transformative change, right? You're accessing so much more energy. Energy is just so much more abundant once you have coal that this has to be crucial to the industrial transformation of the economy that we observe. And certainly, when you look at the English economy, it does become coal dependent via steam engines. The data, though, suggests later than one might think, and other sources of energy, such as water energy, always play an important role until really the late 19th century. So the real age of steam and coal is almost the late 19th century, not the Industrial Revolution itself. Um, Bob Allen brings more of an economist's perspective to bear on this because he then takes into account the prices basically. So it's like why would it matter that coal's abundant? Well, not just that you have a lot of it, but actually now it's become relatively cheaper compared to other sources of energy or other factors of production, and so you can switch from labor intensive production techniques to energy intensive production techniques. And that would make sense in an economy like Britain, where potentially wages were higher than, say, in India or in France, he argues, and now coal's relatively cheaper. So mechanizing something, or it becomes a problem on which engineers and innovators have an incentive to work. How do we save labor? Well, we can use this cheap source of energy. So that's a key part of the Allen story. So I think coal is clearly important, and it plays a role in several kind of iterations or several versions of the story for why Britain industrialized this. But at the same time, economists, as you said, you can always push back and go deeper into these questions. And so economists sometimes have raised some caveats with this story, although I think actually the role of coal is still debated. I don't think we're settled on this, but there's certain caveats to the story. One is I've already alluded to, which is the counterfactual question. If not coal, what else was there? And water technology was a plausible contender as an alternative power source until quite late into the 19th century. So until about 1830, there's many water-powered factories as far as steam-powered factories. But of course, water power means you're restricted to being on a river, basically. But coal's heavy to transport. Really, to use coal in your factory, you need to either be close to a coal source or on the river or sea, so that coal can be cheaply transported via water until the railways really come online. So the difference isn't as big as it might look. The other point economists have raised is a price theoretic kind of incentives point, which is to say, why were the British so so willing to dig for coal in the north of England? It turns out there are coal deposits in Germany, in the Ruhr Valley. There are coal deposits in northern China. So it's not like England's the only location with coal. There's something about the economy in Britain at that time, which is providing the incentives for people to look for cheaper sources of energy. And so there's some work saying, the coal output is responding to prices, so it's very elastic. So it's the economy driving the coal, not the coal driving the economy. I think it's a recent EJ paper though showing that with good identification techniques, even taking that into account, coal does have a positive effect on growth and city growth particularly. But then that doesn't necessarily establish was coal sufficient for the Industrial Revolution. It may just have been a contributing factor.
Maybe this would be a good time, since you brought up the counterfactual point. And by the way, thanks for mentioning prices, so we can rest easy. There's a prices reference in this podcast. Everything's good. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about, use that example, maybe use a railroad example if you want, or whatever comes to mind. Like when economic historians say, the railroads didn't have a big impact, or coal did have a big impact, what are they actually doing? What is the behind the scenes? What is the theory that they're implicitly bringing in, and how are they? It'll obviously depend on papers, but how can you give us a sense of that approach and say a little bit more about it?
Well, yeah, I mean, the more recent approaches are now much more rigorous, and in part because you can do a lot more with data. So particularly like the Dave Donaldson, Rick Hornbeck stuff, where what we'd really like in a counterfactual world is not only say, if you want to say the effect of railroads on city growth or GDP or something like that, excuse me, it's not just how did the railroad affect that city that happened to get a railroad, but wouldn't have in the counterfactual world. There's also, especially for things like transport and excuse me, institutional development, there are huge spillovers that happen with this, which are much harder to quantify. So what the most high-tech recent stuff does is combine theory with empirics to really get at more kind of structurally what is the counterfactual world where this did not exist. Again, not just on the places that whatever X is going to, whatever your X is here, but X on the entire world. This is a really hard exercise to do. It's something that I'd say is still not incredibly widespread in terms of its applicability towards a lot of questions, just because it's incredibly data intensive and it's really hard on the theory side. So there's been some good work done on railroads, for instance, in the United States, that kind of revised Fogle's estimates. So Bob Fogle, Nobel laureate, kind of almost really famously, one of the things that he was most famous for, besides his debates on slavery, was his his papers on the impact of the railroads, where he said that essentially the U.S. economy of the 19th century would not have grown that much more had it not been for the railroads. So the railroads are something like 5% extra GDP growth over the course of the century, which is not trivial, but also hardly the reason the U.S. grew. Whereas it's really so what Hornbeck and or Donaldson Hornbeck do is they look at, say, spillovers too. So it's not just you get a railroad, it doesn't just grow your area, it grows entire markets around you, right? So their estimates are somewhere closer around like 25% of the American economic growth in the century can be attributed towards this. And this type of number, and to be clear, that type of number might be modified 10 years from now, either by them or somebody else that has access to even more finely tuned data. Regardless of what you think of what the numbers actually end up showing, the question you bring up is the counterfactual. How do we think about that? That is inherently a counterfactual exercise, and I think much more generally, this book, and what we're trying to do is bring together a series of papers and books as well that do think counterfactually. To think causally is to think counterfactually. It's not, you can't say that A causes B without considering what happens in the absence of A, right? Because that, is B still going to be there, right? And most of the best papers now, especially empirical papers, that's what they're trying to do. This entire causal inference revolution that has happened in economics and now has spilled over to other disciplines as well, has recently in the last 10 to 15 years really become a thing in economic history. And that's really, I think, a good fraction of the papers that we overview have shed really new light on the things we talked about at the beginning, these kind of 5 categories of explanations for modern economic development. They're all thinking counterfactually, either implicitly or not. I mean, that's kind of what the high level econometrics techniques are doing now. Some are harder to do than others, though, especially when stuff like externalities are considered.
So I think we talked about this when we had Claudia Williamson on the podcast, is that sometimes it's hard to differentiate between what causes growth and what is growth. So if you think about this like coal story, you can say, oh, well, having coal and being able to produce this cheap energy, right, that generates growth. But the generating of energy actually just is growth. That's not right. It's not really a cause. If you think about the cause, the cause might be like a resource endowment, but it's not the use of the thing, right? That's really what growth kind of is. And so one of the things I like about the book is that when you present theories, you guys are actually starting with different sorts of things that at some point are different, right? You think about culture, or you think about institutions, or you think about colonization or geography. Like all of these things, at some point, there's some sort of exogenous variation that you can exploit to kind of figure out what these kind of causes are. But one of the things that I wanted to ask you is that, to me, I think one of the things that students kind of get frustrated by is when we talk about growth, you're sort of always pushing things back like one step further, and then you're sort of generating all this knowledge, but then kind of you get to like the end of a course on economic history, and what happens is students want to know, what kind of policies we can enact to make countries richer, or what are the things that we can do to make countries richer. And I think a lot of the lessons are very difficult because in order for us to find causes, we have to find exogenous variation. And a lot of this exogenous variation is kind of random, right? And so I guess what I'm thinking about is like, to what extent does understanding economic growth contribute to policy making or to contribute to better outcomes for countries and things like that? And to what extent can this line of research actually like help draw more people out of poverty?
Yeah, I think that's a very good question. I'm also aware of the line of reasoning where even the policies the politicians take, right, are responsive to incentives. So even if we make this knowledge available to them, they might not be incentivized to pursue it. And in some case, so like the ability to affect growth, even if we understand it, could be limited on those dimensions. But to take the first part first, like what do we learn? Um, yeah, so one thing it's clear that you don't want to necessarily imitate the policies of Industrial Revolution England, because many of these policies were like I think by almost anyone's standard today pretty bad. Like they stumbled on like things which worked at the time, but it's not like though you imitate the policies which worked in the past necessarily. Um, but you and it's I think one of the easier lessons that we could have most confidence in is like what not to do. So this idea that people who don't know history are doomed to repeat it. So I think Jared, feel free to disavow my statements here in case it's too controversial. But I think that I mean I'm struck by the um, absence of deep historical knowledge amongst a lot of current day economic commentators and policymakers, of particularly those of my generation and around my generation and younger, which have well, I'll take two examples. So one is socialism or communism, which is that we learn from the 20th century that communism or command and control socialism, at least. Like, I don't want to go into the weeds too much. Command and control socialism along the lines envisioned by the Soviets, by Lenin and Stalin and Mao, and implemented across Eastern Europe and the Soviet world, is not compatible or sustained long-run economic growth. It can mobilize tremendous amount of resources in the short run, and so those countries did achieve. The Soviet Union did achieve industrialization. They can achieve some measure of growth during the early stages of growth, where you're focusing on the production of relatively simple goods for output. They were able to sustain themselves for longer than one might think if one was like a full believer in the Mises Hayek position on the socialist calculation debate, but they were not able to achieve long run growth. So not a single one of those societies was able to achieve high standards of living by our definition. All of them had to either abandon socialism entirely or keep it only in name only, which is what happened in China and Vietnam. And so that's a pretty robust lesson. In history and in economic history, we never know anything with certainty. We can't run controlled experiments most of the time, but we know some things fairly well, and that's something I think we know. Yet you see, a lot of people now thinking that those lessons can be put aside in some sense. So I think that's one thing. Another thing, which is a little bit less related to economic growth, is inflation. And so the idea that inflation is not something to do with excess money supply seems to have been an example of people just forgetting history. And so sometimes I think that when one writes history or economic history, it could be trite to repeat things what we already know, right? We're always pushing for new knowledge on the frontier as social scientists and economists. We want to write papers which get into good journals. We want to do cool things. We want to have a clever identification strategy. We want to wow our professional peers. But actually, maybe when we're talking to policymakers, we need to reiterate kind of some lessons from the past and do so in a way which is perhaps more subtle and nuanced than is currently than often happens.
Yeah, you're not gonna get any pushback from us on repeating basic lessons. That is the newsletter, and one just repeat basic lessons again and again. No, that makes a lot of sense. I wonder if there. I was just thinking while you're bringing up this, the Soviet example. Are there parallels between that and previous short run growth? Like, is it comparable to Florence? Is it comparable to Rome? And yes, you can have this short run. There are a variety of ways, and we've seen different times where you get this short run growth. Short run could be almost a century, but ultimately you don't get innovation. You don't get long repeated 2% growth for 150 years. Or is that just a
I
silly
think that
analogy?
I just to jump in. It's probably Jared's central, but I think they're quite different because the Soviet model is really quite unique. It's a combination of things, and it's again there's a counterfactual question here, which is difficult to answer. So how successful or unsuccessful you judge the Soviet growth record really depends on what you think the counterfactual was. So it really depends on your assessment of the Tsarist economy. And so there's been I'm persuaded at least by this body of work associated with people like Paul Gregory and others, which shows that the Tsarist economy was industrializing before World War One. And so, but if you think the benchmark for the Soviet economy is like absolute subsistence poverty, right? Then the Soviet record relative to absolute subsistence poverty isn't that bad. So you can say, look, Stalin killed X number of million people. He sent all these people to the gulag, but he really grew the economy. But it really depends on the counterfactual. And I'm of the opinion that the Russian economy would have grown quite a lot, but absent World War One, and then absent the total collapse you see in the Russian Civil War. It's a little bit of a detour, but I think that that's the critical question in assessing the Russian economy. And there's been some disagreement in the literature about that counterfactual.
Yeah, no, I'd agree with everything Mark just said. I think the one similarity between these and other growth spurts, growth efflorescences, whatever you want to call them, is that they weren't sustainable but for different reasons. And in the case in different cases, you have to look at what some relevant counterfactuals might have been, particularly to get at why they didn't sustain. What in that case, we what this book does and what this literature does is say, well, why did it sustain in one place and not in others? Why did I think one of the great questions which Mark has actually written a bit on, and people like Walter Scheidel have written on, is why didn't Rome have anything remotely close to an industrial revolution? Because this was something where it wasn't just like the Soviet Union, where it was a couple generations. It was centuries of granted, there was obviously a large portion of the Romans were slaves, so it's not, there are different or massive differences between what we're talking about in the 19th and 20th century and in that period. But and this is, I think, one of the big lessons of this book too, is that we have to understand the specifics of the history to get at why say Rome was different from the Soviet Union, was different from Song China, was different from the golden age of the Middle East, of the Islamic Middle East, et cetera. There are some similarities which we can draw, and that's what we've been talking about here. But there's definitely differences into why those different areas eventually fell, and what and what those relevant counterfactuals are. It differs also by those.
I guess maybe the way that what I was thinking in my head and wasn't quite clear is that, you can push one direction and get some success. Obviously, Stalin is the extreme example and horrid and all that stuff, but, you could push and really specialize in being a merchant society. Maybe you can get a little bit of growth from that, or you can push industrialization, not to the Stalin level, but, it's not just Stalin that pushed industrialization in the 20th century, right? But that can get you like focusing in on one particular thing, whether by command or it's just something that arises otherwise, can get you part of the way. But that's not growth in the long run.
Let me jump in because I think it gives us an opportunity to bring up something important in the background, which we haven't mentioned yet, which is the innovative science and the scientific revolution and innovation. So in some sense, that's a background condition. So you can imagine one example of Renaissance economy in general, which I'm persuaded by, and this relates very much to the work of Joel McKeer, is that the Florentine economy is very commercialized. So if you think, let's take a step back. And so if you were talking to like an old school kind of libertarian, and you ask them what's the cause of economic growth? They're like markets and trade, right? That's what causes economic growth. It's revolution. And then then you could say, well, what about the Renaissance or Renaissance Italy? Like, these are city states where the cities are based on trade. Everyone's a merchant, right? And obviously they didn't have like pure laissez-faire or anything like that. But these are very commercial cities. They're doing very well if your metric is trade. But there are some limitations on their ability to kind of expand production and continue to specialize and continue to improve productivity. One is a background level of scientific knowledge, where they just don't know a lot of things about, they don't, for example, know about the existence of a vacuum, so they can't have, even if they had coal, they don't really understand how you could use steam to drive an engine. Another thing that they're potentially missing, and this gets to some other issues as well, is they don't have people capable of really mass producing what we would think of as machines. So one point people often make is that Leonardo da Vinci, who's a total genius, he comes up with all these ideas in the Renaissance for tanks, helicopters, parachutes, and so on, but almost none of his inventions are ever made. And why are they not made? Well, the craftsmen of the time, though they were very skilled by their own standard, didn't have the ability to make basically standardized inputs or, somewhat anachronistically machine tools, that they couldn't, they didn't have the manufacturing capability to build the types of machines, just the types of levers and winches or whatever that he knew he would need to build the types of stuff he had in his head. And so a Renaissance Italy, because of maybe a lack of scientific knowledge on the one hand, but also a lack of a deep workforce of skilled workers, manufacturers, wasn't able to build the types of devices that could, which would have taken its production capabilities to the next level. And so you can think about some background conditions such as science and innovation, which are really important in the long run, in like basically moving the production possibility frontier. Having markets and private property rights important for getting to be on your production possibility frontier, but moving beyond it requires innovation, and innovation is cumulative, right? It takes time, so it takes some time to get to the level where you can make these breakthroughs. And the British in the 18th century were in some sense lucky that they had a thriving, peaceful, commercializing economy, and they were beneficiaries of his cumulative scientific knowledge in a way that the Romans or the Florentines weren't.
To me, a lot of stuff when you when you talk about growth and you talk about economic history, like, it seems like counterintuitive. And what I mean by that is, like, you think about the collapse of the Roman Empire. So after the collapse of the Roman Empire, you have this period of, like, economic decline. You have this period of, like, military weakness, small, they're not even really states, but just small groups, right, of territories just kind of fighting with each other and that sort of thing. And, like, so this is generally, like, a bad time, so bad that we call it, like, the Dark Ages, right? But yet at the same time, then you find economic historians saying, well, this period actually creates the foundation for economic growth, right? And so you can see why people might see this as counterintuitive, right? And so maybe you could talk a little bit about, Europe and kind of what happens in Europe and why this might not be as counterintuitive as it seems.
Yeah, I mean, there's a number of explanations that draw back to the medieval period, some even to the earlier medieval period, which I think is not necessarily widely agreed upon as of now. But so part of it has to do with the breakup of empire, for one. So this is one of those things that actually Mark's done some work on, and others as well, that looks at the dissolution of power among various elites, and how that can be something that eventually, and again, this in a few places, but it did particularly in Britain, led to relatively constrained government that we view as clearly not a necessary condition for modern economic growth. And that, you have a case like China, where The government is clearly not that limited, but yet has still achieved a miracle of growth in the last, in our lifetime. But for the initial onset of growth, and then many of the places that followed, limited governance is a big thing. So governance where the central authority or authorities are somewhat limited by other factors in society, whether they be a judiciary, other legislatures, other elites, things like that. This was something that emerged in the medieval period. Parliaments began to emerge in the late 12th century and really in the 13th and 14th centuries throughout much of Europe. And this probably does have something, almost certainly has something to do with the fractured nature of European politics after the fall of the Western Roman Empire, where you have power that's really devolved among elites, warrior elites. When we think of dukes and earls and other nobility, these are people that they gain their noble status in return for fighting, for the most part. So they have power. This gives them power, and it eventually gives them power to constrain the center. That is, I think, among the institutional explanations, one of the most, at least in my view, most convincing for why, for at least the beginnings. We still have to draw that out, why this happened as it did, and why it happened, say, in England, and certainly in the Dutch Republic, not in Spain, though, for instance. So Spain becomes much more, actually throughout the early modern period, if anything, it becomes much more autocratic. There are plenty of reasons given in the literature, some of which I've actually put forth as well, that explain that. But again, knowing the history is important. I think you're right, though, that it's counterintuitive that the medieval period, which I think is certainly as school children, that to the extent that we heard anything about the medieval period, growing up, say, especially in the U.S., Mark probably had a different experience growing up in Britain, but it was generally not considered the high point of European economic development, for sure. But Josh, so this goes, I think, also back to one of the things you brought up much earlier, that, and the way I describe it to my class is every time you get, to one answer, you have to peel back the onion. So, imagine the explanation that's this big onion with a ton of layers that you just keep on peeling and peeling and peeling. Well, if you want to explain why Britain suddenly became inventive in the mid 18th century, you have to explain how it got there. This isn't something that just randomly happened in Britain in 1800. Certainly by 1700, I think you could argue even a little bit before, Britain was a place that looked ready to, if you were told in 1700 that one place in the world would have a massive change in technological productivity 50 years hence, Britain would definitely be towards the top of your list. Maybe the Dutch Republic might actually be on top, but certainly by then Britain is not a surprise. Whereas had you asked that in the year 1000, Britain would be an incredible surprise. It was fraught with Civil Wars, Viking invaders, things like this, whereas you have Song China, Abbasid, the Abbasid Empire in the Middle East, much more advanced than even the most advanced places in Europe, which was not England at the time. England was well behind Southern Europe at the time. So when we say that if we want to explain what happened in the 18th, 19th centuries, clearly the explanation is not just something randomly happened in the 17th or 18th centuries or even 16th centuries. We have to explain the path. And the path really can't go too far back. In a sense, we do have an idea for when a reversal of fortunes broadly happened. We kind of have an idea, and to be clear, when we use this term reversal of fortunes, it's one that's used in this literature. I don't think it really matters exactly when it happened, because it happened in different places at different times, and it's even hard to quantify what that actually means to begin with. But I think we have a pretty good idea that clearly in the 18th century, something was happening in England that set it off. We also have a pretty good idea that if you want to take the year 1000, 1100, you could even go a little further than that for the case of England. England was behind not just Europe, but other parts of the world on almost every front that we think of as important for economic growth. So something clearly happened in the intervening period. And that's where this literature really gets at. And I think, as I was just mentioning, the institutional changes are pretty clearly happening. in this period, and that's, I think, one of the reasons why a number of economic historians, actually Mark and myself included, have kind of latched onto institutional explanations as being pretty important for understanding these very long run changes. Now, Mark, I don't know if you have really anything to add to that, because I think there's a lot that can be said there. We could probably speak for another hour on these changes, but
Yeah, we definitely could speak for a lot longer. It's very, very interesting stuff. It's really, I'm a huge fan of the book. I'm a huge fan of as a reader of economic history, because, as a theorist coming at it, there's just layers and layers to peel back, as you said, versus a more standard, let's say, labor economics. Oh, there's a minimum wage passed. This happened. Great. There's nothing to peel back. It's not that interesting to peel it back, but I think economic history is so ripe for the use of economic theory, in particular, I hope the type of price theory that we're trying to push. That's what I find so exciting about as a reader, again, of this stuff.
Okay, Brian, can I say something on that front? So I think that in the last, a lot of the literature we've covered has been empirical, and I think, for good reason. There's been an empirical revolution, but I think because of this, to this point, history has to some extent become under theorized in economics, and I think, I think that's probably true across the discipline as a whole. But I think for your listeners, that though there are some fairly low-hanging fruits out there in terms of really applying rigorous economic theory to understanding historical developments. Now, maybe, it's in conjunction with rigorous empirical work, but I really do, agree with you that's where, especially for somebody coming at it from the theory lens, that's I think one of the things that we can really push forward with in this literature maybe over the next decade or two.
That's a great spot to wrap it up. Absolutely. Our guests today have been Mark Koyama and Jared Rubin. Again, their book is How the World Became Rich. We'll put a link to it in the show notes. Thanks so much for coming on Economics Forces podcast.
Thanks, guys.
Brian. Yeah, thanks for having us. It's been awesome.